Ethan had always believed that patience could fix anything. For 2 years, he convinced himself that Madison's demands were just signs of stress, that her expensive tastes were harmless, that love simply required compromise. But lately, something darker had begun to surface. Every dinner felt like a test he had to pay for. Every date turned into another expectation he was supposed to meet. And every time he hesitated, Madison's friends whispered little jokes that stung more than he admitted. Still, Ethan stayed silent, hoping things would change on their own. He didn't realize that the final crack in their relationship wouldn't come from an argument or a mistake, but from a single sentence spoken at a crowded birthday dinner. A sentence sharp enough to shatter everything he thought he knew about her. Ethan arrived at the upscale restaurant feeling slightly out of place, adjusting the sleeves of his only tailored shirt as he walked inside. Aurelia glowed with warm gold lighting, the kind that made every dish look even more expensive than it already was. He spotted Madison waving him over, her smile bright but her eyes scanning him as if checking whether he fit into the scene she curated. Her friends, Ava, Chloe, and Josh, were already halfway through their cocktails, laughing loudly and talking over one another. The moment Ethan sat down, a server appeared with suggestions from the premium section of the menu, clearly encouraged by the group's earlier enthusiasm. Before Ethan could even open the menu, Chloe ordered a bottle of champagne priced higher than his weekly groceries. Ava added 2 appetizers for the table, though Ethan noticed she ordered the ones she personally liked. Every dish that followed seemed chosen with the sole purpose of pushing limits. Rare steak flown in from Japan, truffle pasta, desserts dusted with edible gold. Ethan tried to gently mention that he'd planned a more modest evening budget, hoping to reset expectations before things spiraled. But the moment the words left his mouth, the entire table fell silent for half a second before erupting into laughter. Ava leaned forward with a smirk, asking if he was really counting pennies at a birthday dinner. Josh shook his head and muttered something about dating men who can't keep up. Madison didn't defend him. She just sipped her drink, eyes fixed on her phone, pretending she didn't hear anything. Ethan felt a familiar sting behind his ribs, the kind he'd felt many times recently, but tonight it dug deeper. He forced a smile, trying to steer the conversation elsewhere, but his words drowned in the noise of their arrogant confidence. When the entrees arrived, Chloe delivered the final blow. She glanced at Ethan, raised her glass, and said loudly enough for nearby tables to hear, "Real men pay and shut up." The table burst into giggles again, but everything around Ethan muted into a cold blur. He stared at his plate, then at Madison, who still didn't look at him. A quiet calm settled over him, sharp, decisive, unlike anything he'd felt before. He stood up, reached for his wallet, and walked straight to the counter. The server looked surprised when Ethan asked for a separate bill, but didn't question it. He paid for his own meal, left a reasonable tip, and thanked the staff with a politeness he couldn't extend to anyone at the table. As he turned to leave, he saw Madison finally lift her head, confusion crossing her face. But Ethan didn't slow down. He didn't glance back. He walked past the velvet curtains, out into the night air, leaving behind the laughter, the luxury, and the people who had pushed him one step too far. Inside, the group stared at the check that remained on the table, an unmissable total of $1,600, realizing for the first time that Ethan wasn't coming back to save them. Madison burst into the apartment like a storm breaking through the door. Ethan was sitting on the couch, still wearing his dress shoes, replaying the dinner in his mind when her furious footsteps echoed through the living room. She didn't pause. She didn't breathe. She launched straight into shouting, her voice shaking with anger rather than hurt. "How could you embarrass me like that?" she snapped, throwing her purse onto the floor. "You walked out and left my friends with a huge bill. You owe them. You owe me." Ethan looked up at her, tired rather than startled. He'd expected a reaction, but not this level of entitlement. "I paid for my part," he said calmly. That's all I'm responsible for. Madison scoffed so loudly, it almost echoed off the walls. Responsible? Seriously? A real boyfriend would have taken care of the whole thing. Instead, you made me look like an idiot in front of everyone. Her voice cracked at the edges, not from sadness, but from the fear of losing control. She stepped closer, arms crossed tightly, as if trying to corner him with her presence alone. You're going to fix this, she demanded. You're going to send the money to Ava and the others right now. Ethan stood slowly, feeling a strange steadiness settle into him. A quiet understanding that tonight had shown him more truth than the last 2 years combined. I'm not paying for a table of people who mocked me, he answered. And I'm not letting you treat me like an obligation anymore. Madison blinked, thrown off by his tone. For a moment, she seemed to search his face for some sign of hesitation, some weakness she could latch onto. When she didn't find any, her voice rose again. Are you seriously doing this? Over dinner? Over a stupid bill? Ethan shook his head. It's not about the bill. It's about everything leading up to it. He gestured toward the open space between them, the invisible wall that had been building for months. You don't see me as a partner. You see me as a wallet. The words hit her like cold water. Her jaw tightened, and her eyes narrowed into a defensive glare. That's ridiculous, she snapped. If you felt that way, why didn't you say something earlier? I did, Ethan replied quietly. You just never listened. Silence followed, heavy and suffocating, but not enough to dissuade her. So what now? She challenged. You're breaking up with me, is that it? Ethan took a breath, steady and final. Yes. Madison froze. She wasn't used to losing. Not arguments. Not people. And I need you to pack your things, he added. The lease is in my name, you know that. Her expression twisted from shock to disbelief, to rage in a matter of seconds. You're kicking me out, after everything I've done for you. Ethan met her eyes without flinching. After everything I've let slide, he corrected. Madison let out a bitter laugh, a sound that didn't match her trembling hands. You're going to regret this, Ethan. But he didn't respond. He simply stepped aside, giving her space to walk past him. For the first time in their relationship, he wasn't bending. And for the first time, she realized he wasn't someone she could control anymore. Madison returned 2 days later, this time without the fire of confrontation, but with a cold determination that felt even heavier. She didn't come alone. Ava and Talia followed behind her, each holding large tote bags as if they were entering a department store rather than Ethan's apartment. Ethan watched them from the hallway, arms crossed, already sensing that today would not be simple. Madison barely looked at him as she announced, We're here to get my things. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Ethan nodded toward the bedroom. Your clothes and personal items are in the closet. Everything else stays. Madison rolled her eyes but walked in with her friends, rifling through drawers and grabbing whatever they could reach. At first, Ethan stayed quiet, giving them space, but it became obvious they weren't just taking her belongings. Ava unplugged the air purifier Ethan bought last year. Talia wrapped her arms around a Bluetooth speaker that Ethan knew Madison had never paid for. Then Madison reached for the kitchenware, pots, pans, even the coffee maker Ethan used every morning. Hold on, he said, stepping into the doorway. That's mine, all of it. Madison didn't even pause. You gave it to me, she shot back. You said I could use everything here. Use, Ethan repeated. Not take. Madison's eyes flashed with irritation, but she didn't argue further. Instead, she moved toward the console table, where Ethan kept his electronics. When she reached for the camera bag, Ethan stepped forward immediately. No, he said sharply. That stays. Madison froze, fingers wrapped around the strap. This was a gift, she insisted. It's mine. Ethan pointed to the small label on the side of the bag. the one with the serial number matching the receipt he had saved. "That was a gift to help you start your content channel," he said. "A gift tied to a relationship that no longer exists. I paid for it, and I have the documentation. You're not taking it." Ava scoffed from behind her. "Seriously, you're going to be petty over a camera?" Ethan didn't even look at her. "It's $3,000, he replied. "And yes, I'm keeping it." Madison's expression tightened, shifting from frustration to something more calculating. She slowly released the strap, as if reconsidering her next move. "Fine," she muttered. "Whatever." But the tension in her jaw told Ethan this wasn't the end. The three women resumed packing, though now with more glances exchanged between them, more hushed whispers, more annoyed sighs when Ethan stopped them from grabbing things that were clearly his. By the time they finished, the living room looked like a storm had blown through it. Madison stood near the door with her bags, staring at Ethan with an unreadable expression. "You've changed," she said finally. "No," Ethan replied. "I just stopped ignoring what I should have ended a long time ago." Madison's lips pressed into a thin line, but she said nothing else. She walked out without a goodbye, Ava and Talia following closely behind. When the door closed, Ethan let out a long breath, relieved yet unsettled. He didn't know why, but something in Madison's silence felt wrong, like the calm before a much bigger storm. Ethan didn't realize anything was missing until late that evening. He'd finally gathered the energy to put the apartment back in order, returning items to their shelves, folding blankets, and tossing out the empty hangers scattered across the floor. It wasn't until he approached his desk that a strange chill ran down his spine. The small spot where his external hard drive usually sat was empty. At first, he thought he'd misplaced it. He checked the drawers, the cabinet, even the backpack he sometimes used for work. Nothing. A growing tightness formed in his chest. That hard drive wasn't just storage, it was years of his life. Every photography project he'd poured his heart into, every client's final edits, every personal snapshot he'd saved since college. Gone. He replayed the afternoon in his head, remembering Madison lingering near the desk, while Ava asked him distracting questions about cookware. He hadn't noticed anything unusual then, but now the pieces clicked together with sickening clarity. She had taken it. He sank into his chair, trying to steady his breathing. Maybe she'd grabbed it by accident. Maybe it was mixed in with her things. But deep down, he already knew that wasn't true. His phone buzzed suddenly, vibrating against the wooden desk. The message came from an unknown number. A single line appeared on the screen. "I have something of yours. Let's trade." Ethan stared at the message, anger rising like a slow-burning fuse. He forced himself to reply steadily. "What did you take?" The response came instantly. "You know what it is." Another message followed. "If you want it back, give me the camera. No camera, no drive." It wasn't even subtle. It was blackmail, plain and simple. Ethan felt a bitterness settle in his throat. He had expected anger, immature behavior, maybe even petty revenge. But this was deliberate theft. He typed back, "That hard drive has my client's work. You had no right to take it." For a moment, there was silence. Then another message flashed onto the screen. "You owe me. After the way you treated me, this is nothing. Bring the camera tomorrow and you'll get the drive back." Ethan stood up, packing the apartment. He could practically hear Madison's voice behind the words. Cold, self-righteous, completely convinced she deserved whatever she wanted. He gripped the back of the chair, feeling an anger he hadn't allowed himself to feel in weeks. Not because of the drive alone, but because this confirmed everything he feared about who she had become. He typed carefully, every word sharp with control. "You stole from me. Return the drive." This time, she didn't bother with subtlety. "If you don't want to cooperate, that's on you. I'm not giving it back unless you give me the camera. Your move." Ethan locked his phone, jaw tight. The apartment felt suddenly colder, quieter, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. She had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. And for the first time, Ethan felt the shift inside him. Not fear, not frustration, but resolve. He wasn't going to negotiate with someone who thought theft was leverage. He wasn't going to let her win by resorting to threats. Whatever came next, he knew one thing with absolute certainty. This wasn't just a breakup anymore. It was a battle she had started, and one he was fully prepared to finish. Ethan woke up the next morning with a clear head, as if the night had sharpened his focus instead of exhausting it. Anger still simmered, but it no longer clouded his judgment. He sat at his desk with a notebook, laying out everything he knew and everything he would need. He started by pulling out the receipt for the camera, the one he'd kept folded neatly inside a tax folder. The serial number was printed clearly, matching the label on the side of the device, now sitting safely in his closet. Next, he opened his bank app and downloaded the transaction history from the month he purchased it. Then he took screenshots of the text messages she had sent, every line where she admitted having the hard drive and demanded the camera in exchange. It wasn't anger guiding him anymore. It was structure, method, precision, an instinct he'd honed as an analyst but never thought he'd need in his personal life. By noon, he had assembled a complete documentation packet, each piece stored on multiple backups, ready if anything escalated. But he didn't rush to send it. He crafted an email instead. It was firm, concise, and professional, the kind of message someone would forward to law enforcement without needing clarification. He addressed it to Madison's personal email, knowing she checked it obsessively. At the top, he summarized what she had taken. Below that, he listed the serial number and proof of ownership of the camera. He attached images of her text messages, highlight circles marking the incriminating lines. He ended the email with two options. Return the hard drive within 48 hours at a public location of his choosing. Or he would file a formal police report for theft and extortion, with an attached digital packet ready to present. No negotiation. No argument. Just consequences. He reread the email twice before hitting send, making sure every word was calm and factual. Then he turned off his phone notifications and waited. 2 hours passed before her reply came in. The tone had changed noticeably. There was no venom, no bravado, only short sentences full of hesitation. We both overreacted. You don't have to involve the police. We can talk about this. Ethan responded with a single sentence. The instructions are in the email. The next day was silent. By the second morning, she finally messaged again, this time from her normal number instead of the burner she'd used before. I'll return it. Where do you want to meet? Ethan suggested a coffee shop near a busy intersection, a place with cameras and constant foot traffic. She agreed reluctantly. When she arrived, she handed him a plain tote bag without making eye contact. Inside, wrapped in a sweater, was the hard drive, untouched, unharmed, exactly as he remembered it. She tried to speak, maybe to defend herself or twist the story into something softer, but Ethan didn't give her the space. He thanked her for returning the property, turned around, and walked away without a backward glance. The moment he stepped outside, he felt the first true breath of relief in days. He had his work, his memories, his years of creativity back in his hands. More importantly, he had reclaimed something Madison had tried to take from him long before the hard drive. His boundaries. His voice. His control. PH letter 1EA7N5, 500 T letter 1EB. Ethan spent the night gathering every scrap of evidence he had, refusing to let rage cloud his judgment. He pulled out the receipt for the camera, flattening the paper on his desk as if it were a legal document. The serial number was printed clearly at the bottom corner, matching the tiny tag sewn onto the camera bag. He took screenshots of his online banking history showing the purchase date, the vendor, and the exact amount he paid. Then he collected every text message Madison had sent him, the admissions, the threats, the ultimatum she thought would break him. When he read the line, "Bring the camera or you get nothing," a strange calmness washed over him. She had practically confessed in her own words. He drafted an email, not a text, because he wanted something formal, something she couldn't manipulate or twist later. His fingers typed steadily, methodically, as he laid out the facts. "You have taken my external hard drive without permission. This item contains years of my professional work and personal files. You are currently in possession of stolen property." He attached the receipt, the messages, and a brief timeline of what had happened. Every word was deliberate. Every sentence sharp enough to cut through her arrogance. He added one final paragraph that sealed the tone of the message. "You have two options. Return the hard drive to me within 48 hours at a public place of my choosing, or I will report the theft and blackmail attempt to law enforcement. The documented value of the stolen and demanded items qualifies for a criminal charge." He sat back, reading the email one last time. Nothing emotional. Nothing impulsive. Just facts. He pressed send. Almost instantly, the unknown number buzzed again. The message he received was defensive, panicked, and sharp with denial. "You're seriously threatening me over this. You're not going to the police. Stop acting like you're some victim." Ethan didn't respond. He let the silence stretch. The next message came minutes later, shorter, more frantic. "You're overreacting." Then another. "You don't have to do all this. Just give me the camera." But Ethan still said nothing. He knew exactly what he was doing. By morning, the tone shifted completely. The new message read, "Can we talk?" He ignored it. The pressure was working. That afternoon, a final text arrived. A single sentence. "Fine, I'll bring the drive." Ethan felt his shoulders loosen for the first time in days. She wasn't apologizing. She never would. But she was surrendering because she had no other way out. 2 days later, at a busy cafe downtown, Madison showed up with the hard drive wrapped in a scarf. She didn't meet his eyes when she handed it over. Ethan checked the device carefully, verifying the serial number and confirming that all files were still intact. Only then did he nod. Madison muttered something under her breath, but Ethan had already turned to leave. He had won, not by shouting, not by bending, but by outsmarting the very person who believed he would always cave. And for the first time since the breakup, he felt completely in control of his own life again. PH letter 1EA7N6, 500 T letter 1EB. Madison's life began unraveling far quicker than she expected. The moment Ethan walked away from that cafe, the first thread of her carefully curated world snapped. Ava and Talia, who once treated her like a center of gravity, stopped replying to her messages. They hadn't forgiven her for the $1,600 dinner debacle, and now that Ethan was no longer covering the financial gaps, the consequences were suddenly hers alone. The group chat that used to buzz nonstop went completely silent. Within a week, she realized she had been quietly removed from it. Madison tried reaching out individually, but every message was either ignored or answered with short, clipped responses. The truth was simple. Without Ethan's stability and his wallet, she wasn't valuable to them anymore. Her influencer journey didn't survive the fallout either. Without the camera, the equipment, or Ethan's editing skills, her content quality dropped instantly. Brand inquiries dried up. The sponsorship she counted on for the next month canceled after seeing a noticeable decline in engagement. She tried filming with her phone, but it wasn't enough to maintain the aesthetic she had worked so hard to fabricate. And when the bills rolled in, subscription fees, apartment costs, personal expenses, she realized she had no way to afford the lifestyle she had built on borrowed luxury. Her landlord sent a notice. Her credit card hit its limit. Her savings were barely enough to last 2 weeks. With nowhere else to turn, Madison swallowed the pride she once wore like armor and called her relatives in another state. She packed her things into 2 overstuffed suitcases, leaving behind the city she thought she'd conquer. She ended up in a small suburban home belonging to her aunt, sleeping in a guest room filled with old family photos and mismatched furniture. There were no rooftop bars, no luxury brunches, no curated weekends for Instagram stories. Just quiet routines, early mornings, and long shifts at a retail store that hired her out of pity more than qualification. Every time she scrolled past old photos of herself draped in designer outfits she didn't pay for, she felt something twist inside her: shame, resentment, and the faint, bitter sting of reality. She told herself Ethan had ruined her life, but deep down, she knew better. She had built her world on shallow foundations, and when it collapsed, it was Ethan who pushed. It was her own doing. Meanwhile, Ethan's life shifted in the opposite direction. With the hard drive returned, he dove back into his photography with renewed energy. He reconnected with clients, updated his portfolio, and even received an invitation to feature his work in a local exhibit. Friends who hadn't seen him in months noticed how much lighter he seemed, how much clearer his focus had become. He upgraded his living space, rearranged the apartment, and replaced memories of conflict with quiet routines that felt genuinely peaceful. He wasn't running anymore. He wasn't trying to fix someone who didn't want to change. He was finally building something for himself. And as Madison folded clothes in the back of the retail store, wondering how everything had slipped away, Ethan stood in front of a gallery wall, admiring prints of his own photographs, proof that letting go had been the best decision he ever made. Ethan stood by the window of his apartment, watching the city lights flicker like distant embers. For the first time in months, the air around him felt still, untainted by tension or expectation. He thought about everything that had unfolded: the dinner, the confrontation, the theft, the battle that followed, and realized how long he had ignored the quiet voice inside him that kept asking for something better. The chaos Madison brought into his life had finally burned itself out, leaving behind a strange clarity. He wasn't angry anymore. He wasn't bitter. He was simply done carrying the weight of someone else's wants, someone else's entitlement, someone else's constant need to take. As he looked around his apartment, the space finally felt like his again, clean, calm, and honest. He understood now that walking away hadn't been a moment of weakness, but a moment of strength he had denied himself for too long. He had chosen logic over manipulation, truth over illusion, self-respect over comfort. And in doing so, he reclaimed not just his freedom, but the version of himself he thought he had lost. The city outside hummed softly, inviting him forward. Ethan exhaled, steady and sure, ready for whatever came next.